So last week, Anthropic releases Opus 5 and everyone is blown away. It combines the thoughtfulness of Fable 5 with the execution strength of GPT 5.6 Sol. On top of that, this is an extremely efficient model, so you don't burn through your weekly tokens in a day. And this is all we wanted from Anthropic. The problem is that people who claim that this is a really good model mostly tested it on single-shot tasks. It could one-shot solutions really well. And when you start testing it on long horizon tasks, you could see the cracks starting to show. It basically forgets the tasks that it wanted to do, it gets confused and doesn't quite understand your intent. It just wants to do stuff no matter if it understood your goal or not. So the disappointment started settling in. And in parallel to that, there was something brewing behind the scenes. You remember those benchmarks that Anthropic posted and that they celebrated that they're so much better than GPT? On this particular benchmark, ARC AGI 3, which is an interactive reasoning benchmark where humans score 100% and Frontier AI just a couple months back was scoring under 1%, Opus 5 was now not only scoring about 30%, but it was crushing GPT 5.6 Sol. GPT 5.6 Sol had about 10% score and Opus 5 had over 30% and it was cheaper. But OpenAI, and rightfully so, thought that this doesn't make any sense. And they published a new report where it turns out GPT 5.6 is actually SOTA on this benchmark, and they only changed two settings. Turns out that the initial test on this benchmark did not retain reasoning efforts and did not apply compaction properly. And we're going to talk about the implications here and how important harnesses are. But first, let's understand what was happening behind the scenes. So the initial score was around 12% at 3 million output tokens. And the new score with less than 500,000 tokens are close to 40%, which means on this benchmark, the real score is that GPT 5.6 is somewhere here. It's way smarter than Opus 5 and way more efficient. OpenAI has published a great blog post on the topic, and they visualize how the official harness performs with the lower score and how their own harness performs when they enable reasoning and compaction. I've noticed that when using GPT 5.6 model, especially the latest ones, their compaction is so incredible that it could go implement long-running tasks that span over days. This is obviously something that OpenAI has put a lot of effort and thought into. It is starting to pay off and it is a big differentiator with their models, and this is what has been proven here. OpenAI is saying that when they first saw GPT 5.6 low scores, they were puzzled. GPT 5.6 Sol has solved long-standing open problems in mathematics and beaten games like Pokemon Fire Red, but it just scored 7.8% and GPT 5.5 could barely play games at all, scoring 0.4%. So something didn't add up there and they investigated. And this is a very crucial paragraph here because we are shifting from model intelligence to harness intelligence. We discovered that turning on two API settings we use in ChatGPT and Codex retained reasoning and compaction, tripled scores, and cut output tokens by 6% on public task tests. I have found OpenAI models to be much more reliable on long horizon tasks, and I think that comes from the harness and not from the smartness of the model itself, because under the hood, that's a loop that is implemented in the harness, and part of the input comes from the model, but part of it comes from how the environment in the harness is implemented. I find Anthropic models to perform much better on long-running tasks when we have dynamic workflows enabled, but the problem with dynamic workflows and Claude is that they burn so many tokens that you have to proactively opt in. And I feel like what OpenAI does is that they have the same feature in the backend, but we don't really notice it because GPT models are so much more efficient. I also think that OpenAI models are much better in compaction, while Anthropic's models would get confused after compaction and would forget what the goal was. By the way, it's also not only about the harness, it's the combination of harness and model, because we have a lot of reinforcement learning and improvement on the models happening on traces that are within the harness where the model is used. For example, if you have a bad chat with Codex, it would be discarded. And if you have a good chat with Codex, OpenAI would take this whole conversation and then apply reinforcement learning on their models. Now, this reinforcement learning, though, has happened within Codex, which means that the model has learned how to call tools, how to compact, how to summarize reasoning efforts within Codex itself, which means that if you run Codex in another harness or environment, it may not perform as well because it hasn't been taught in this specific environment. And we can see here a great blog post by one of the developers on the PyCoding agent, better models, worse tools. And this is because Anthropic has done reinforcement learning on Opus 4.8 within the cloud harness specifically, which means that this model doesn't perform as well in Pi anymore. The more post-training happens inside one dominant harness, the more every other harness will have to inherit its quirks. So I would say using the model with the right harness is equally important, and right now OpenAI probably has the best harness, especially for long horizon tasks, although Anthropic has the smartest models. These days I mostly work with GPT 5.6, especially after they have fixed their front-end issues. I use Fable 5 from time to time as well, and by the way, I have found Opus 5 to be better at slightly lower reasoning efforts if you want to give it a try. Well, that was all from me for today. Thanks a lot for watching. See you next time. Без съм next mal благодаря за следващия път.